I wasn't looking for anything that afternoon. It was one of those in-between days where the hours seemed to drift without shape. I had stopped by the cafe near the park, the kind of place I usually went to write or clear my head. The air was filled with the faint hum of soft music, the scent of roasted coffee beans, and the gentle clinking of cups against saucers. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then she walked in. At first, I only noticed her in fragments. The sound of her heels against the wooden floor, the subtle sway of her coat as she removed it, the calm steadiness in her posture. She wasn't the kind of woman who tried to claim attention. She didn't need to. It was the quiet sort of presence that made you aware of her without quite knowing why. I found myself stealing a glance, then another. Her hair, swept loosely over one shoulder, caught the soft glow of the afternoon light pouring through the window. There was a confidence in the way she carried herself, but also a kind of stillness, like someone who had learned not to rush through moments. She placed her order and, by chance, sat a few tables away from mine. I returned to pretending I was focused on the page in front of me, but my eyes betrayed me. Every so often they wandered back to her. She seemed absorbed in something on her phone at first, then in the small ritual of stirring her drink. And then it happened. She looked up and our eyes met. Just for a second, maybe two. I thought I would look away quickly, embarrassed at being caught staring. But I didn't. Neither did she. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't polite or automatic, not the kind of smile you give to strangers in passing. It was slower, warmer, carrying with it an unspoken acknowledgement. The sort of smile that felt less like a greeting and more like a secret shared. And in that simple curve of her lips, in the way her eyes softened as though she understood something about me without words, I felt a shift. My chest tightened, not from nerves exactly, but from the strange recognition that something had just begun. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story, but I knew that smile would stay with me. I lowered my gaze after a moment, pretending to return to my notes, though the words on the page had blurred into nothing. My thoughts had scattered. I could still feel the warmth of her expression, as if it had left an imprint. And as ordinary as that afternoon had been up until then, I knew, deep down, that it was no longer just another day. That smile carried a weight, a promise almost, whispering that everything I thought I understood about my life was about to change. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. Yet a few days later, fate, or coincidence, placed her directly in my path. This time, it wasn't in the quiet haze of a cafe, but in the brightness of the park that stretched near the edge of town. I had gone there to clear my head, to walk without purpose. The late afternoon sun spilled long shadows across the path, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and the promise of rain. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting on a bench beneath an old oak tree, a book in her hands, her expression somewhere between focus and ease. For a moment, I considered walking by without saying anything, but something in me resisted the thought of letting the moment slip away. My feet carried me closer before my mind had caught up. She looked up, perhaps sensing me near, and her expression softened into recognition. "You are the writer," she said lightly, her tone carrying a trace of humor. I blinked, unsure how she knew. Then I realized she must have seen the notebook in the cafe. "Trying to be," I admitted, offering a sheepish smile. "And you're the one with the unforgettable smile." It slipped out before I could stop myself. She tilted her head, amused, as though she hadn't expected such honesty. For a brief second, I thought I had overstepped, but instead of pulling away, she let out a soft laugh, the kind that lingers in the air even after the sound fades. I asked about her book, grateful for something safer to hold on to. She turned the cover toward me. It was a novel I hadn't read, one she described with a careful choice of words. Her voice was low, steady, each sentence touched with thoughtfulness. We talked, but not in the hurried way strangers often do. Our conversation stretched slowly, like a river finding its way around stones. She asked me about writing, about why I did it. I stumbled over my answer, feeling clumsy, until her eyes held mine long enough to make me feel. At first, I worried they would feel awkward, but they didn't. Instead, the quiet seemed to carry its own meaning. She would glance away toward the trees, or down at her hands resting on the open book, and I would find myself watching her without the need to fill the space. At one point, as I handed her the pen she had dropped beside the bench, my fingers brushed against hers. It lasted less than a second, but the spark of warmth was undeniable. I felt it rush through me, an awareness sharp enough to make me forget whatever I was about to say. She noticed too. I could see it in the way her breath paused ever so slightly, though her expression remained calm. When our eyes met again, the silence was louder than words. That was the beginning. Not the first smile, not even the first meeting, but the first time I knew this was more than chance. After that afternoon in the park, it became harder to pretend she was just someone I'd happened to meet twice. Her presence lingered in my mind in quiet ways. A look across the cafe, the rhythm of her voice, the warmth of her laughter, it all returned in fragments when I least. But then she looked up, and her expression shifted instantly, warmly, as if she had been expecting me. "You again," she said, her tone more playful than surprised. I sat down across from her, trying to act casual, though my pulse betrayed me. We talked about simple things, weather, books, the way this town always seemed to hold on to its routines. Yet beneath every word was a current I couldn't ignore. It was the small details that drew me in. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. How her eyes softened when she laughed, or how she leaned in slightly when listening, making me feel like no one else in the room mattered. At one point, I said something half serious, half joking about how I was terrible at keeping plants alive. She laughed, an easy, full laugh, and then shook her head. "You just need patience," she said, her voice dropping into something more gentle. For a second, I wondered if she meant more than just plants. And then there were the silences again. She'd glance down at her cup, tracing the rim with her fingertip, and I'd feel an almost unbearable urge to reach across the table. Not to grab her hand, but simply to bridge the quiet space between us. I didn't, of course. I told myself it was better not to. But every time I left her side, the thought lingered. Did she feel it too? That invisible thread, pulling us closer, even when we both tried to act as though we hadn't noticed. By the time I stepped back into the fading daylight, I realized something had shifted. She wasn't just a woman I enjoyed talking to. She was becoming a part of my days, woven into them so naturally, I couldn't remember when she hadn't been there. And though I tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. I was beginning to look for her. Always. It was an evening that arrived almost by accident. The cafe had closed earlier than usual, and the streets outside carried the cool stillness of late night. She suggested a short walk, and I agreed, though neither of us seemed eager to part ways. The air smelled faintly of rain, the lamps above us casting pools of gold across the pavement. We ended up sitting on a bench near the quiet river that cut through town. The water moved slowly, reflecting the scattered lights from the bridge above. For a while, we said very little. I had grown used to those silences with her. They didn't feel empty, only waiting. Then, without warning, her tone shifted. "Do you ever feel," she began, pausing as if testing the weight of her own words, "like life didn't turn out quite how you thought it would?" I turned toward her. The woman who usually carried herself with such composure suddenly looked fragile, her gaze fixed on the water instead of me. "Sometimes," I admitted, "I think everyone does." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I had plans once. I thought by this age, I'd have everything figured out. But instead, I've collected more mistakes than certainties." Her voice was quiet, but each word carried a heaviness I hadn't heard before. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something told me it wasn't about details. It was about the simple act of being heard. I let the silence stretch, then said softly, "Maybe mistakes are just the proof that we've been trying." She looked at me then, truly looked, eyes glistening faintly in the dim light. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She didn't speak. She just breathed, as though my words had loosened something inside her. I didn't know what else to offer, so I reached out. My hand found hers where it rested on the bench, my fingers light against her skin at first. She didn't move away. Instead, she let her hand stay there, warm beneath mine, her thumb brushing once, almost unconsciously, against my knuckles. It was a small gesture, yet it carried a depth I couldn't name. I felt it ripple through me, settling in my chest. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You have a way of making things sound simple." "Maybe that's all I'm good at," I said with a nervous laugh. Her hand tightened slightly around mine. "It's more than you realize." We sat there, hands joined, listening to the quiet rush of the river. No declarations, no confessions, just two people allowing their walls to lower piece by piece. I didn't need to know the full story of her past. In that moment, all that mattered was the way her vulnerability felt like trust. And as I walked home later, her touch still lingering in my palm, this time, neither of us moved. The contact was subtle, barely there. Yet it felt like the air thickened around us, like even the smallest movement could break something fragile and irreplaceable. I stole a glance at her. She wasn't looking at me directly, but her lips carried the faintest hint of a smile, as if she knew what was happening and chose not to stop it. Her hand rested on the table, not far from mine. The space between our fingers seemed impossibly small, and yet it felt like a canyon. I wanted to reach across it. I wanted to feel her hand in mine, to let the tension resolve into something real. But hesitation held me still. A dozen thoughts tangled in my mind. What if I was misreading this? What if it ruined the fragile trust we'd built? Was she pulled away? She turned her head then, and our eyes met. For a heartbeat, we just looked at each other. Her gaze held a softness, but also something unspoken, like a question she wasn't ready to voice. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, I closed it again, lowering my eyes to the coffee between us. The silence grew heavier, though not unkind. Her knee brushed lightly against mine beneath the table. Whether by accident or intention, I couldn't be sure. The touch lingered, though, and I felt my breath catch. We stayed like that, close enough to feel the edges of each other's presence, yet held back by an invisible line neither of us dared cross. When I left that night, the cool air outside felt almost shocking against my skin. I replayed the moment again and again, haunted not by what had happened, but by what hadn't. The hesitation hung between us now, waiting for the day one of us would finally answer it. Would you like me to move forward and expand part 6, the shift, where one of those hesitations finally breaks? For days after that evening at her table, I couldn't stop thinking about the hesitation that had hung between us. The closeness, the near-accidental touches, the silence that felt too alive to ignore, it all replayed in my head like a song caught on repeat. When we saw each other again, it was late afternoon. The sky outside hinted at rain, and the world seemed quieter, more subdued. She had suggested meeting at her place again, this time to help her rearrange a few shelves. I told myself it was nothing, just another excuse to spend time together, but beneath the surface, I knew it was more. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. She moved gracefully around the room, pulling books from one shelf to another, her hair falling loose as she reached upward. I offered to help, and soon we were side by side, the task simple enough to blur into conversation. At some point, she turned toward me, holding a small frame she had just uncovered. It was an old photo, faded around the edges, and for a moment her expression softened into something unreadable. She said nothing, just placed it carefully on the table and let out a small breath, almost like a sigh. I wanted to ask what memory lingered in that frame, but instead I stayed quiet. She didn't need questions, she needed presence. And then, in a moment so ordinary it became extraordinary, it happened. She noticed the collar of my shirt slightly askew. Without hesitation, she reached out. Her fingers brushed lightly against the fabric, tugging it back into place. The gesture was simple, almost domestic, yet the closeness of it stole my breath. Her hand lingered a second longer than it needed to, fingertips grazing against the side of my neck. The room seemed to still around us. I looked at her, and she was already looking at me. Eyes steady, lips curved in that same quiet smile I'd seen the first day. But this one was different, deeper, almost daring. I whispered her name, not even meaning to, the sound escaping more like a question than a word. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let her hand fall gently, though her eyes never left mine. The silence between us grew thick, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. And then she smiled again, the same smile that had changed everything at the beginning. Only now it carried a weight, a warmth, an invitation I could almost step into. I didn't move closer. Neither did she. Yet something had shifted. The boundary we had been circling for weeks was no longer invisible. It was clear, fragile, waiting. As the rain began to tap gently against the window, I realized this wasn't just hesitation anymore. It was possibility. The air between us had changed. We both felt it. And even without words, I knew, sooner or later, neither of us would be able to hold back. The rain had passed by the next evening, leaving the streets washed clean, the air carrying that fresh, quiet scent that comes only after a storm. She suggested a walk, something simple, unplanned. I agreed, though my heart knew this wasn't just another evening. Something had shifted, and we both felt it. We wandered along the river path, the water moving slow and dark beneath the fading light. Neither of us spoke much at first. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that made room for thought, for breathing, for feeling. Every so often our shoulders brushed, and neither of us stepped aside. At one point, she paused by the railing and leaned against it, gazing out at the ripples across the water. "Funny, isn't it?" she said softly. "How life changes in the smallest moments? A glance, a word, even a smile." Her voice was steady, but I could hear something beneath it, an honesty, maybe even a hint of fear. I stepped beside her, resting my arms against the railing too. "I know," I said. "I didn't expect any of this, but I don't want it to stop." She turned her head then, eyes searching mine. For the first time, I saw the quiet vulnerability she usually kept hidden, a mix of doubt and longing. It made her seem even more real, more human, more hers. I didn't think. I simply moved. My hand found hers, slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, her fingers curled into mine, warm and steady, as if they had been waiting there all along. The world around us seemed to fade. The distant hum of the city, the murmur of the river, even the cool breeze tugging at our coats. What remained was the weight of her hand in mine, the unspoken truth passing between us in that single touch. We stood there for a long time, not needing to fill the silence with words. Every so often, she would glance at me, and I would catch the faintest trace of that smile, the one that had started everything. Only now it felt like more than a beginning. It felt like a promise. Eventually, we walked again, our hands still joined. There was no rush, no need to define what this was or where it was going. All I knew was that I didn't want to let go, and for the first time, she didn't seem to either. As we reached the edge of the park, I realized how much had changed in such a short time. That first smile had been a spark, quiet but undeniable. Tonight, it had become something else entirely, an anchor tying us together in a way neither of us could ignore. I didn't need to say it out loud. The way her hand fit in mine, the way her eyes softened when they met mine, the way she leaned just slightly closer as we walked, all of it told me the truth. Everything had changed, and it was only the beginning.